I'm Mieke Mulders and I'll be your host to explain how to use data outputs on mintBlue. First, let's talk about data outputs. Further, we'll talk about sending data output transactions to the Bitcoin ledger. And finally, I want to verify my transaction via the mintBlue console to make sure the data has been stored. So, what is a data output? A data output allows you to store arbitrary data on the Bitcoin blockchain. You can format the data however you like. Optionally, you can protect sensitive information by encrypting the data output with your secret key. Other users can explore any data you store on the Bitcoin blockchain. Therefore, to store sensitive information, we must encrypt the data to hide it from other users. Alright, let's get coding. Here you can see the data output interface. In our case, it's mandatory to include the type property, which indicates the data output type. Further, you can store any textual information in the value property. And lastly, you can sign or encrypt the transaction by setting those booleans to true. Now, let's look at a code example showing how to create data outputs within a mintBlue transaction. Okay, let's create our index.js file and let's paste in the base template code that you can find in the SDK Getting Started tutorial. You'll have to replace the SDK token and a project ID with your own details. So now, let's add some code. First, let's define our outputs array. The outputs array contains our data output, which is an object of the type data. This is mandatory. Further, we can define the value property, where we can store a string, or we can also later store any kind of other textual information like a JSON object. So now let's send the transaction to the mintBlue platform. We want to print the transaction ID and call the createTransaction method on the client object. This method accepts an object with a project ID attached and our outputs array. So, and then as a final step, I want to log the transaction ID to the terminal with a link to what's on chain, so you can also quickly look up the transaction on what's on chain. So now let's change the data to a more realistic example using a JSON object where we store our order ID. We store our ordered data, and we store the order items. These can be multiple items of different JSON objects again. So as you can see, you can continue nesting information. And finally, let's try our code. I have replaced the SDK token variable and the project ID with my details. And let's use the node index.js command to execute our script file. And this will create a transaction via the mintBlue platform on the Bitcoin blockchain. Okay, let's verify our transaction by going to the dashboard. Then we go to projects and we select our data output project. We go to the transactions tab and we can click on the view button to inspect the details of our transaction. And here you can see our data output with the order details. The payment output you see is a change output from mintBlue, and you can ignore this output. Thank you for completing the how-to guide. You can find the full code at the bottom of the how-to page. If you want to learn more, check out the how-to guides for the other output types. Learn how to combine outputs and take a look at example applications to get a feel of how to implement mintBlue into real projects.